Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all from wherever you're joining us. I'm Babita Bisht, Deputy Director of External Affairs at the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, and on behalf of our team, welcome to our virtual event called The Climate Finance Opportunity in Developing Countries, How the Green Climate Fund Delivers Climate Action. This event is being held as part of US Climate Week. I am also honored to introduce our moderator, Mr. Carlos Curbelo, former Congressman. Carlos has been at the forefront of bipartisan support for climate action, such as the House Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus and the Senate Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus too. His vision, passion, and pragmatism is well known, and we thank him for joining us today. We also have a great lineup of speakers who will speak to the importance of climate investments from the different vantage points. Of importance is working together to solve the complexity of the climate challenge. Let's start with a short film on GCF, and then Carlos will take over. Thank you once again for joining us. We look forward to an interesting discussion.
Babita, greetings from Miami, and hello to everyone who's joining us. What a great pleasure to be with all of you this morning for this very important event, which is focused on how do we help developing economies, developing nations throughout the world jumpstart the transition to clean energy? How do we help millions of people all over the world build more resilient communities? That's why we're gathered here today. We have a wonderful program that awaits all of us this morning. And I just want to thank the Green Climate Fund for this opportunity to be a small part of this very special gathering. We all know the nature of the threat. We all know the nature of the challenge. I became a passionate climate advocate after a meeting with scientists from the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in 2015. I had always cared about the environment, but after meeting with NOAA scientists while I was in Congress, I came to understand fully what this threat represented for my community, the southern tip of the state of Florida, which is so exposed to sea level rise, to storm surges, and obviously we're seeing other effects here, like ocean acidification and what it means for coral reef systems and marine life. And the list goes on. And we know that people all over the world are facing these challenges. And again, our purpose here today is to explore how we can deliver this clean energy transition all over the world, how we can make sure that the entire world can mitigate, reduce emissions, and also adapt, build resilient communities to prepare for that which is inevitable. So again, many thanks to all of you for joining us today. I want to invite you to join me for a brief walk through the program so that we know what we can expect here today, and then we'll get things started. First, to kick things off, we'll hear opening remarks from Yannick Remark, which is the great leader of the Green Climate Fund, our executive director. For those of you who don't know, although I think everyone who's joining us today is fairly familiar, the GCF is the world's largest dedicated fund helping developing countries reduce their greenhouse emissions and enhance their ability to adapt to climate change. So Yannick will kick us off. Then we'll have an important message from John Kerry, former Secretary Kerry, which is the US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. This will be followed by introductory remarks from Marty Durbin of the US Chamber of Commerce, someone I know well and someone who has shown great leadership in terms of waking up the United States business community to the significance and the importance of this challenge and the need for their participation. After Marty, we'll hear from Erica Lennon, representing the CSO and faith-based community. She'll talk about empowering global transformative climate action. After that, that'll be our last speaker, and then we will go into a roundtable discussion, a panel. And for that panel, we're fortunate to have Craig Kogut, Chairman, CEO, and founder of Pegasus Capital Advisors, Dante Mossi, the Executive President of the Central American Development Bank for Economic Integration, Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder of and CEO of Acumen, and M. Sandhyayan, who is the CEO of Conservation International. So again, it's a wonderful program, a lot of insights, a lot of important information that will be shared here today. And with that, I would like to invite Yannick to make his opening remarks.
Many thanks, Carlos, and 1,000 thanks for accepting to moderate this session. Distinguished guests, dear colleagues and dear friends, we have a small window of opportunity to prevent average global temperature rising by 2 degrees Celsius against pre-industrial levels, and an even smaller window of opportunity to keep the rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Temperatures have already increased by 1.1 degrees Celsius, and developing countries, which have contributed little to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, are the first to suffer the consequences of rising sea levels, more frequent extreme weather events, and severe droughts. If the rise reaches 1.5 degrees Celsius, 14% of the world population will already be exposed to severe heat waves at least once every 5 years. At 2 degrees Celsius, sea level rise will reach 1.5 feet by 2100, and coral reef will decline by 99%. If the world does not act, then a 4 degrees Celsius rise is possible, which will have catastrophic consequences, with coastal cities inundated, increased water scarcity and malnutrition, unprecedented heat waves, and irreversible loss of biodiversity. It is critical to act now and act decisively. The UNFCCC NDC synthesis report issued last month indicates that we are currently nowhere close to where we should be to reach the Paris Agreement goals and keep the rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. What is required is nothing less than a societal transformation to ensure that our economic system aligns with the needs of the planet and of its people. Global political momentum, a necessary condition to this transformation, is growing. The US government Leaders Summit on Climate this week is a key example I congratulate the US government for its marshalling of global leaders to focus international attention on climate change. Increasing the flow of climate finance to developing countries is another necessary condition. They are being hardest hit by climate change and have the least fiscal capacity to address it, particularly as they try to recover from the economic shock of COVID-19. With the value of climate finance opportunities in developing countries between now and 2030 estimated at up to $23 trillion, and with about 14 trillions of negative yielding debts in OECD countries, this should not be an issue. Capital in search of higher yield should naturally flow from OECD countries to developing countries. But this is not happening. The bulk of climate finance is invested in its country of origin, revealing a strong preference among investors for home country investments where risks are well understood. The higher upfront cost and longer payback periods of many climate investment magnify the perceived higher policy, market, technical, and operational investment risk in developing countries. As the world's largest climate finance fund, the Green Climate Fund aims to accelerate and scale up climate innovation and investment in developing countries. We divide our finance equally between adaptation and mitigation measures, with over half of our adaptation funding going to least developed countries, small island development states, and African states. And with a portfolio now valued at over $30 billion, including $8.4 billion in GCF resources, we are leveraging our investment to remove barriers to transformative and inclusive climate investment. We do this by fostering and investing in new technologies, business model, and practices to establish their commercial track record and accelerate their widespread market adoption. We have 4 pathways for our efforts. First, we provide grant funding to countries to integrate their climate and sustainable development ambition, as well as COVID-19 recovery effort, translating them into an investment pipeline for climate action. Integrated policies could reduce total required investment by up to 40%. Second, we catalyze policy, technical, managerial, and financial climate innovation. In the context of COVID-19, financial innovation is critical to increase developing countries' access to finance without increasing their debt burden. Third, we use a variety of instruments, grant, concessional debt, equity, guarantees, etc., to de-risk frontier investment in these new climate solutions at scale. Finally, we help align finance with sustainable development by sharing knowledge of commercially successful climate solutions and strengthening climate financing expertise of domestic financial institutions to accelerate their widespread adoption. You will hear soon from our partners on how the organizations are using GCF funds to drive these changes. And I would like very much to use this opportunity to deeply thank all of you for joining us tonight, or tonight Korea, or this morning for you in the States. But first, we will watch a video statement from US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, Secretary John Kerry. The renewed strong commitment of the US to the Paris Agreement and to the Green Climate Fund is a hugely positive development. And we certainly welcome the recent announcement by the US administration that is, will ask Congress for $1.25 billion in funding for GCF during this budget cycle. I am deeply grateful to Secretary John Kerry for taking the time to record this special message for us. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Yannick, for reminding us of the nature of this challenge, the important responsibility that developing countries have but also the opportunities for developing countries to make these investments to support jobs and technologies that have been developed in these countries and that can be deployed all over the world. As Yannick previewed, we're now going to hear an important message from former Secretary of State John Kerry, who is the US Presidential Envoy for Climate. Let's watch together.
I'd like to thank Yannick and Carlos for inviting me to join today's event. And while I obviously regret I can't join you in person today, it'd be a lot nicer, I still wanted to make sure that I sent along this short video as a note of thanks for all the work that you're doing. The reason that I took on this job as Special Presidential Envoy for Climate is to help raise global ambition in our efforts to tackle the climate crisis. We are in much greater trouble than a lot of people want to admit, and we absolutely need to keep the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree goal on the table. We need to keep it alive, and we must make significant investments in adaptation to cope with the climate change that's already happening, and of course to try somehow to invoke environmental justice to protect poor and vulnerable people. At the same time, the private sector is recognizing that tackling the climate crisis also offers one of the greatest commercial opportunities in history as we retool in order to decarbonize our economies by 2050. However, we cannot do this if the finance isn't there. Concessional finance in particular is critical. Finance provided on terms below market makes it possible to de-risk new technologies, to boost private investment, to pioneer new approaches, pilot new ideas, demonstrate new concepts, and help build up the resilience of the poorest communities. This is obviously where the Green Climate Fund is an indispensable player. Only a few days ago, the administration announced that it will be asking Congress in this budget for $1.25 billion in new funding for the Green Climate Fund in the next budget cycle. Were it to be funded, this would be the first U.S. contribution to the GCF in over 4 years and the largest single contribution that the U.S. has yet made, and I assure you is just the beginning of what we intend to do. This contribution will go a good way toward paying down on our $2 billion outstanding pledge, and President Biden knows we need to contribute going forward, and even now we have started to consider exactly how to provide scaled up resources to the GCF. Given the GCF's central role in the global climate finance architecture, President Biden and I wanted to send a clear signal that we value the fund's work and we look forward to investing in its work in the years ahead. Today's conversation is focused on driving transformational investments. We're counting on the GCF to do more than just deliver funds to developing countries. More than that, we need the GCF to also enable countries to build up their own technical capacity, unlock new capital, drive technological change, and shift the world into alignment with the Paris Agreement's goals. The GCF is now delivering on this promise. When we adopted the Paris Agreement, the fund was just approving its first projects. 5 years later, the GCF has a portfolio of 173 projects in every region of the world with a total value of over $30 billion. Many of these projects are enabling countries to put new ideas to work and to scale up existing ideas. For example, the GCF has partnered with a U.S. entity to support off-grid solar power in East Africa through the world's first climate change fund targeting low-income populations in developing countries. Another example is a financial vehicle undertaken with another U.S. entity, which helps fill the financing gap for mid-size, low-carbon, and climate-resilient infrastructure in countries around the world. But we need even more innovation. That's especially true in adaptation and resilience portfolio, where the need is greater than ever, and the challenge is particularly acute. Because this isn't just a question of dollars mobilized, it's equally one of empowering poor folks and the vulnerable and those among us who are feeling climate impacts most severely. The GCF still has more work to do in streamlining its governance processes, fostering inclusion, and improving access and efficiency. And the United States wants to be an ally and a partner in those endeavors. We need the GCF functioning at its absolute peak capacity in the years ahead. So thank you for the work you do. Thanks again for your time today and letting me take part in this. And best of luck to everyone.
That was Secretary John Kerry, the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, to whom we are very grateful for his participation in our program today. We appreciate his highlighting the importance of delivering capital to developing countries all over the world, both for mitigation and for adaptation. And we are especially grateful for him reiterating the Biden administration's commitment of $1.25 billion for the Green Climate Fund in the president's budget. Of course, that will go to Congress, where Republicans and Democrats, we hope, will work together to get this passed. But Secretary Kerry, again, thanks to you and to your colleagues in the Biden administration for your commitment and for the time that you have given us for this program today. Now we want to move over to the realm of U.S. companies and businesses, and we have a very significant leader from that community here today. Of course, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the loudest, most prominent voice for U.S. businesses in our country, before the Congress, before the world. And representing the Chamber this morning is a friend of mine, someone I know well, and again, someone who has made major contributions when it comes to climate, clean energy, and climate policy. Please join me in welcoming Marty Durbin of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce.
Well, thank you, Carlos. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you to both you and to Yannick for the invitation to join such an important conversation. It's indeed an honor to join you who's continued your climate leadership and of course to follow Secretary Kerry. Now, I currently serve as Senior Vice President for Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and also serve as President of the Global Energy Institute. And I've been asked to reflect on how companies are adapting to the need to focus on addressing the global climate challenge in order to remain competitive. I've spent the last 25 plus years representing industrial and energy companies, from plastics to chemicals to oil and natural gas, and now with the Chamber of Commerce, the entire economy. It's been fascinating to watch the evolution of corporate focus on social responsibility, on sustainability, and of course, on climate. That evolution has only accelerated in the last 10 years, 5 years, and even the last 2 years. There's no doubt there have been pressures from investors, from shareholders, from customers, from employees of these companies, and of course from policymakers. And each of those have helped to amplify this dynamic. But corporations are largely making long-term, market-based strategic decisions to ensure that they remain competitive and successful in a changing global market where public expectations are also evolving. Companies have made and are making significant commitments to reduce emissions, to improve efficiency, and to influence their supply chains. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce represents companies from every facet of the economy, both domestic and multinational corporations. In my relatively brief time at the Chamber, I've yet to meet with an existing member company or companies that we're hoping will join as members that don't prioritize sustainability and climate. I can tell you that's different from where things were at the beginning of my career. Now, these dynamics, a focus on sustainability and a desire to remain competitive, have also created a wave of innovation that I believe holds the key to addressing the global climate challenge. I'd like to say just for a moment, at the end of last year, Congress passed what was probably the most significant climate-focused legislation in probably 2 decades. and few people know about it, known as the Energy Act of 2020, but it included funding for energy and climate innovation, all different types of technologies from renewables to battery storage to advanced nuclear and carbon capture and others as well. It also included a phase down of HFCs, which is another important part of the equation here. But what I think was even more important was that was passed with strong bipartisan support in both the House and the Senate, showing us that there is a path forward to having consensus and support for moving forward with significant climate policy and climate progress. But back to innovation, it's that the same entrepreneurial spirit and innovation that spurred a shale energy revolution that allowed natural gas to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States is driving progress in battery storage, renewables, advanced nuclear, as I mentioned, carbon capture and removal technology, hydrogen, and more. And we know that meeting the global climate challenge will require clean energy technologies that can be affordably deployed at scale in the developing world. Achieving our long-term emissions reduction goals will clearly require technologies that don't yet exist or are not yet commercial. This means we should not foreclose any technology, including natural gas and carbon capture technologies, that can contribute meaningfully to efforts to reverse emissions growth trends globally while meeting growing energy demands that we know are there. So technology cooperation, public-private partnerships, innovative financing, and capacity building are necessary for facilitating commerce and climate solutions. And you all know better than I that the opportunities for blended finance and public-private partnerships to both leverage public money and also mobilize private capital to help deploy and scale the innovation of greenhouse gas emission reductions. Finally, I would simply highlight the need for the business community to be at the table with you to develop the programs necessary for all of us to succeed. I hope you'll continue to seek our input and engagement, and I know I speak for my colleagues at the U.S. Chamber in offering our partnership in this effort, and certainly want to reach out to Yannick and run an invitation to speak with our members. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to working with you.
Marty, thank you so much for your comments and for joining us this morning. And what a timely engagement by the U.S. business community, just as there's a new administration that is looking to re-engage the world on climate issues. We see U.S. companies at the table wanting to make contributions. That is just something that I think the entire world can celebrate. So many thanks to you for being here today and for being part of our program. Before our panel, we're fortunate to have one more speaker, which is Erica Lennon, a senior attorney at the Climate and Energy Program at the Center for International Environmental Law. Erica, thank you so much for joining us this morning. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Carlos, and good morning from California. First, let me start by thanking the GCF for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be speaking alongside virtually the others committed to the success of global climate action that the GCF exemplifies. And while I'm speaking here today, there are many other civil society groups, Indigenous peoples, and local communities who have also long engaged with the GCF. The Green Climate Fund is a critical institution for climate action around the world, as has been emphasized by scientists, politicians, academic, activists, others this morning, and critically, people around the world who are living at the front lines of climate change. We're in the midst of a climate emergency, and it requires urgent action. And real climate action requires real climate finance. The GCF was created to fill a void in the recognition that it was necessary to have a dedicated multilateral mechanism for providing climate finance to the developing countries working to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Since then, it has become the world's biggest multilateral climate fund and an important channel of climate finance for developing countries. Civil society groups, from environmental justice groups to faith-based groups to women's groups and many others, and Indigenous peoples advocated for the creation of the GCF on the recognition that climate finance is a critical element to addressing climate change, and since then have been involved in its development and now its ongoing work. And once the GCF was mandated, civil society groups continued to play a role in its development, including advocating for the GCF to not be the same as, but to be different from other financial institutions that have so often failed to serve the needs of communities and catalyze transformative change. By providing direct access to financing, by putting human rights and gender at its core, by having a more equitable governance structure than traditional development finance institutions, and by being driven by what countries and communities identify as their needs, as those who are on the front lines of the climate crisis are the ones who need the finance the most and are best placed to know what the best solutions are. Civil society and Indigenous peoples demanded that the GCF do things differently. And now that the GCF has been in operation for several years, it is genuinely a multilateral institution with a balanced board of members, with a balanced board of directors of members from developed and developing countries. And from the beginning, it embraced a gender-sensitive approach, which is the first for a climate institution to establish from its outset. And it's critical as women and girls are disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis and possess critical knowledge on solutions to it. It has also led the GCF to adopt critical policies, including an environmental and social policy, an Indigenous peoples policy, a gender policy and action plan, to ensure that projects have positive outcomes for people and the environment, as well as combating the climate crisis. In addition to that, they've developed a robust accountability structure with independent units to ensure integrity, evaluation so that the GCF continues to learn, and accessible avenues for redress. These policies, along with others, are critical to the GCF being able to catalyze the paradigm shift toward low emission and climate resilient development. The GCF is still a young institution at only 5 years old, and while there is room for improvement, it continues to develop its policies, such as further environmental and social safeguards, and to grow and to learn, and importantly, to work to provide finance for transformative projects and programs. And civil society organizations, Indigenous peoples, and local communities continue to engage to help it do so and to urge it in the right direction, including by engaging directly with the communities who are most impacted by the climate crisis and by putting people at the center of climate action. As the climate emergency worsens, the need for predictable and accessible finance does too, especially as the climate emergency and COVID pandemic compound the issues facing communities around the world. Tackling these crises will take billions upon billions of dollars. And to that end, the US, as the largest historical emitter and largest economy, should immediately contribute $2 billion remaining from its initial pledge to the GCF, and must further commit to providing at least an additional $6 billion to the GCF as part of the first replenishment. It is critical that the GCF has the resources it needs to help developing countries mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis. And the US must join other countries in providing these resources. The climate crisis is the greatest human rights challenge of our time, and it is essential that more action is taken to enable countries to develop in a way that mitigates climate change and allows them to adapt and become more resilient to the crisis. The GCF plays a critical role in this fight, in part through its large network of partners that can help build much needed capacities in developing country institutions to manage robust climate programs. We need urgent climate action to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees and to adapt to the crisis. And communities around the world need the GCF and the resources it can provide to enable them to adapt to and mitigate the climate crisis now. Thank you.
Erica, thank you so much for your contribution and for that reminder of the issue of climate and environmental justice. Obviously, there are people who will be affected disproportionately by the worst impacts of climate change. And of course, there are people who will be impacted disproportionately by the world's efforts to mitigate and to prevent the crisis from growing even worse. And of course, it's important as we all make investments throughout the world to keep them in mind. So thanks again for your participation this morning. We're now going to move on to our roundtable discussion. For that, we are joined by Craig Kogan, Chairman, CEO, and founder of Pegasus Capital Advisors, Dante Mossi, Executive President of the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, M. Sanjayan, CEO of Conservation International, and Jacqueline Novogratz, CEO of Acumen. Thank you all for being this morning. I have a first question here for all of you. We will take answers in the order that I just introduced you all. Climate finance is key to make the ambitious steps necessary to avert the catastrophic impact of climate change. Scientists have been warning that we're already crossing some boundaries, for example, on climate, biodiversity, the nitrogen cycle, and unless we act urgently, the consequences may be irreversible. We also know that the current decade, the decade of nature and climate action, is critical. The race is on to cut emissions by half by the year 2030, and again by half the following decade to reach the goal of net zero by 2050. These are monumental tasks, to say the least. From each of your unique vantage points, what are the opportunities and challenges to invest in climate action in developing countries in the context, of course, of the Green Climate Fund and its mission? Craig, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Yannick and Babita, for giving us all the opportunity to be here today and get this great event going to tell everyone about what the Green Climate Fund is doing. I've been investing in sustainability, as some others on this event, for over 30 years, and it's gratifying too to see more mainstream investors investing broadly in ESG, but particularly in climate change. But as Carlos said, as Yannick said, as Secretary Kerry said, we're way behind. And we're really just scratching the surface of what we need to do in the climate arena. So the opportunities are immense. As Secretary Kerry said, there are huge economic opportunities. There's white space, particularly in the developing world in sectors other than renewables, waste, water technologies, agriculture. There's going to be a huge pivot coming up there. The challenge really is we're way behind. It's very comfortable for people, the finance community, to invest in large scale renewable projects in the developed world. We don't need money for that. We need people to take risk, to spur innovation. And the challenge is to, I think, give people comfort, knowledge about the new sectors, about new technologies, and work both with governments, local governments at the provincial, state, and municipal level, as well as foreign governments, as well as providing capital and risk, changing the perception of risk. And that's a big part of what the Green Climate Fund is doing.
Thank you so much, Craig. Dante, your take?
Thank you very much. Good day to everyone. It's 6 a.m. local time here in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, and my main reason for being here is to show the commitment of CABE to the climate change challenge for Central America. We are a region that produces very little greenhouse gases, yet the impact are devastating. We had last year 2 hurricanes, category 5, separated only 2 weeks from each other. That's something we have never seen before, and we have actually been big supporters of the Green Climate Fund, and that's why we actually, one of the main reasons why we're actually reaching out to Korea, the newest country member, and we are opening an office in Korea to be closer to the Green Climate Fund, because we think we are partners in this adventure, and we need help in several departments, but most of all is actually knowledge. We are actually going forward with investments in the climate change arena. CABE has invested over $5 billion in adaptation infrastructure in the region, but more is needed. And we look forward to the guidance and financing from the Green Climate Fund to do innovative projects, as it was mentioned before. I mean, innovative means technologies that have never been used in the region. For example, we have the electric train in San Jose, Costa Rica. This is a fantastic project that shows that we can do sustainable transport, a sector that we talk little in terms of green climate gases contributions. And so we are actually working together with the Green Climate Fund to give credibility and attract investors to come to this fantastic project in Costa Rica for $1.5 billion projects. We're also working with coffee plantations to help them to grow coffee in a sustainable way and to keep the tree cover alive. So my message to everyone here is that we can make a difference. As mentioned before, we don't need a whole lot of money. We need a lot of innovation and creativity and private sector participation, because governments with this COVID crisis have expanded greatly and at a great risk of macro stability. So we need to involve the private sector in as much as possible whenever there's an opportunity for a return out of doing the things right, particularly in transport. And from Central America, a region that doesn't produce cars, for example, we have been reaching out to companies that manufacture cars to come to this region. We believe in electric mobility. Countries like Costa Rica that are decarbonizing the country. So there are a lot of opportunities. We are not a region that looks for free money. We are a region that looks for opportunities for development. And we have fantastic partners like the Green Climate Fund, and we look forward to work together. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you so much, Dante. Now let's turn it over to Sanjay.
Thank you, Carlos. Good morning, Yannick and everyone. Good to be here. I think everyone understands the challenges, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the opportunities. You know, the thing that kind of strikes me and just is totally amazing to me as a scientist is that carbon, natural carbon on the planet, is not evenly distributed. So about 3.3% of the surface area of the planet contains almost 50% of what we call irrecoverable carbon. That is carbon, if once lost, you can't get it back in our lifetimes or in our children's lifetime. That is amazing. It's a huge, fortunate fact of nature. It also tends to be in the global south, in developing countries, not all, but much of it. So it provides an amazing opportunity to really target our investments in developing countries. It's a huge opportunity to really make a major jump in our carbon budget and how we manage carbon by targeting investments that 3.3% of the surface area of the planet. The second thing I would say is that when you look at the corporate sector and their willingness to get involved in this at a scale that I had never seen before. I mean, just for Conservation International, right now, the partnerships we have with companies like Apple or P&G or MasterCard, these are 10x the order of magnitude than they were like 3 years ago, 10x. And that tells me that A, these companies have strong balance sheets. B, they're willing to invest for the long term. And the growing market for many of these companies is going to be in the global south. It's going to be in Asia, but of course also in the Americas and to some extent in Africa as well. We need to find better mechanisms for those companies to put that balance sheet to work in the countries that we really care about. And that is a key role that the Green Climate Fund can play. And then finally, I would say jobs in this post-COVID environment. The thing about investing in nature, natural climate solutions and nature-based solutions, both for climate mitigation, but also for adaptation, is that it also provides rural jobs. And rural jobs are the ones that are going to be the hardest to recover in a post-COVID environment. Most of the efforts that governments are making are going into cities and industrial centers, and we understand why. But that rural job that's been lost, that one family who moved from the countryside to the city for a few years to make some money to send that one kid to school, now that they've gone back, for them to make that journey again, that's basically one generation that's lost to higher education, for example. So the ability for us to spur rural sustainable jobs in the long run is really linked to nature. And to me, it's then linked to some of the mission of the Green Climate Fund. Those, I think, are incredible opportunities that we need to lean on. Thanks.
Thank you, Sanjay. And let's hear now from Jacqueline.
Thanks so much. And thanks, Yannick, Babita, Carlos. It's really an honor to be here. And it's actually extraordinary to listen to this whole panel because it spans business, human rights, and Sanjay bringing it in with nature, and GCF holds all of that. To round it out, I've spent the last 20 years really focused on backing entrepreneurs with long-term investment, focused on solving the big problems of poverty. And over the last decade, have really seen unequivocally that you cannot solve problems of poverty if you don't integrate climate realities. for the poor. We know that the poor are disproportionately impacted. To pick up on what Sanjay was talking about, just last year, 20 million low-income people, mostly living in rural areas, were forcibly displaced from climate crises. So they end up in cities and frankly in nations without being able to carry the only assets they own, which is their land, on their back, with very few skills, no networks, few resources, and an inability to really operate. So this is instability for them and instability for all of us, which makes this Yannick's urgency even greater. We've been lucky to partner with Green Climate now on 3 major projects. And the only one I want to talk about first is in the sphere of off-grid energy, which Secretary Kerry mentioned, because I think it really underscores how you can also build opportunity by creating new markets if you're willing to use the kind of creative concessionary capital that GCF has been willing to deploy, and it keeps them in a very rare category. In 2007, when we made our first energy investment in off-grid solar, 1.5 billion people in the world had no access to electricity. Enormous problem and opportunity. And in that lies what keeps me up at night, which is that the developing world must develop economically. And it has to be balanced with doing so in ways that enable the poor to have resilience and also to mitigate long-term climate effects. And that's not an easy balance to hold, but when you look at off-grid energy, it provides an example. By 2016, we became the largest off-grid energy investor for the poor in the world. And yet what we were looking at was a fledgling ecosystem wanting to come to life. Very few investors, including impact investors, would take risks, even on these companies that were in some cases $30, $40 million companies. That's when GCF came in and partnered to create Kawisafi, which I'll talk about later, which allowed us to become part of building an ecosystem, which now on a global level accounts for about 400 million people getting access to electricity and light and 400,000 jobs. It's this kind of market creation in ways that are good for the planet and for people that is the opportunity. And it's one that needs the kind of leadership that we're seeing with the risks and the partnerships that GCF is creating.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I'd like to introduce now a question from the audience or a topic, and I'd invite any of you to weigh in. But it's about parallels between the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, specifically regarding the uneven impacts of the pandemic throughout the world's economies, and also the nature of the investments made by international organizations and the global community to try to mitigate the pandemic. Does anyone have any thoughts on that they'd like to share?
I mean, I can quickly say that, that there is a lot of parallel in terms of what we might do about it. Despite the unevenness with which we are tackling COVID, and I'm not meaning to say that we've done it brilliantly, it is still kind of remarkable that so many countries collaborated so quickly with so much money focused on multiple solutions to a global problem for which individuals have to take action. You got to wear a mask, you got to get vaccinated, etc. But governments have to play a key role in keeping people safe as well. So if you actually wanted a almost dress rehearsal for what we need to do to deal with climate change at scale, COVID provides that in some way, except climate change is infinitely more challenging and bigger. But you can't do it alone. You got to do it together. You got to do it fast. You got to do it now. Individual action with government action have to go hand in hand in order to create a comprehensive solution to a global, almost existential threat to our economy, our existence. To me, it's a dress rehearsal.
If I could just build on that, I love what Sanjay just said. It's also about making a long-term commitment to these sectors and being willing to act very quickly, and as Sanjay said, collectively. I gave you the stats on off-grid solar. when it was clear within 5-6 months of the pandemic that already 30% of the 500 off-grid energy companies had collapsed, losing tens of thousands of jobs. We worked with GCF and a number of other institutions and helped catalyze what we hope will close as a $90 million facility to provide concessionary debt, guarantees, philanthropy, so that we can provide, so this facility can enable energy companies to meet their short-term liquidity crises. It's that kind of collective action that we also need to build into the system, because again, we're working in fragile economies with fragile ecosystems on the new infrastructure level that is a better kind of infrastructure for very low income people, but it takes a different kind of leadership. GCF moved very quickly. They brought in 9 African partners within I think it was like 110 days. I mean, within 5 months, essentially, and enabled this facility to bring in 16 partners, including 4 other DFIs. Again, early stage, take risk, in this case, junior debt, to bring in other kinds of financing so that we can all move quickly to build the right kinds of companies.
And if I could maybe just give a slightly forward-looking view, because I totally concur with what Sanjay and Jacqueline said, but just as we've seen our health systems do well, but they also failed, I think, in this, and we need to build more resilient futures. The world, as we rebuild health systems, the linkage between adaptation, as Sanjay spoke about earlier and Secretary Kerry did, and preparing for health crises, I think go together. So I think one of the great opportunities, going back to an earlier question, is to link human health and planet health. And it's something I know the Green Climate Fund is actively working on, and we are. So we are going to have future pandemics. And as we build green infrastructure around the world, particularly in developing countries, we have to think about the health consequences as well.
Thank you. Thank you all for those perspectives. And anyone who in the audience who has a question, please submit those. We will try to get to as many of them as possible. We want to focus on the question of innovation. When people think about climate change solutions or climate solutions, of course, they think about electric vehicles, solar, wind, but really there's so much more potential. There are so many other opportunities. There are ideas that are just nascent. And if you could all discuss those and perhaps focus on how these are opportunities, not just for developing countries to be the beneficiaries of these technologies, but what are the opportunities or the benefits for what we tend to call donor countries, the developed countries that are, for example, investing in the Green Climate Fund and in other initiatives? Are there opportunities for their economies to support jobs, to launch investments? Let's discuss innovation, not just in terms of the benefits for the countries that really need the assistance to transition to a clean energy economy, but also to the countries making these investments.
Well, when it comes to innovation, thank you, Carlos. I get incredibly excited, particularly in the sectors other than the ones you said we've tended to focus on. And I'm looking at some of the participants here representing US companies who are creating jobs and have amazing technologies to export around the world. And I'll just mention there's companies taking waste and turning them into energy, biomass companies, companies that have water technologies that are so desperately needed. And I mentioned earlier agriculture. There are amazing agricultural technologies which have the benefit of both helping improve the climate as well as human health and nutrition. I think a number of these technologies in working with the developing world will also end up being more applicable to actually deployment as well in the developed world. So I think that's one huge area of innovation. Again, we haven't focused enough. Waste isn't as sexy as an electric vehicle, but waste is a problem throughout the planet, and it's also a tremendous opportunity. The other area of innovation that maybe isn't as clear, but it was touched on before, is the need for everyone to collaborate. And I think we can learn a lot from what we're doing in the developing world, where we're needing to be innovative with public-private partnerships, with NGOs, and various local community organizations. And I think that's something with the new type of innovation, getting these technologies adopted, we can learn dramatically from in places like the United States.
Am I next? Thank you, Carlos. Now, yes, beyond the usual suspects of green investments, I must say that I'm particularly thrilled by being a partner with the Green Climate Fund in a small, fund to actually to go to small and medium producers of coffee. Let me tell you why I think this is innovative. Innovation means to work with the environment and with markets. Here at Central America, we produce one of the best coffees of the world. And regretfully, we sell those coffees as a commodity, New York prices. And so the farmer gets really low prices, and they cannot sustain their economy. And they abandon the coffee plantation, and they decide to cut off the trees to get some income. And eventually they leave and they migrate to the US mainly. So this is beyond a human tragedy, because people is leaving their home and going through a lot of suffering to get to the US. They also are destroying the environment. So we have this is a rather small project, but I think it's shows a lot of promise, in which we are actually bringing long-term funding to coffee growing with quality. I mean, coffee that is recognized that it's working with the environment, not against the environment, that is working with the indigenous communities, and is keeping really traditional and ancient ways of picking up coffee in a sustainable way. And people like you and me drinking good quality coffee in the mornings, with smell and taste. And I'm sorry, I look at it like an advertisement, but coffee in America is pretty good. Thank you, Sanjay. And I hope that's coffee. And so that's innovation, and Jacqueline as well. So thank you. So I think innovation involves agriculture, involves working with the communities to find out what is it that is really creating a barrier for them. In this case, with the Green Climate Fund, we have bet against long-term financing as a way to sustain environments, local environments, in a sustainable way, and earning, this trust from the local communities that this makes sense. It makes sense for them to take care of their forests. It makes sense for them to sell coffee with the quality. This is organically grown and cut by indigenous peoples, and by people in Germany drinking coffee in a responsible way. So this is the type of innovation I think we should do more, and I trust we will keep on doing this type of project in the near future. Thank you.
Carlos, if I could just add one quick thing. First of all, Dante is completely right. Coffee is the beverage that will wake the world up to climate change. I mean, it is so sensitive to climate, and we will quite literally run out of room to grow coffee if we don't do our jobs in the Green Climate Fund and other mechanisms. On innovation and tech, here's the two quick things I would add. One is that I think the tech leaps that you've seen in other industries hasn't been mirrored enough in the climate space. I mean, our ability to monitor forests, our ability to predict where tuna will move, things like that, just haven't really fully made it into the work that we're doing on climate. That will change. But more to Craig's point that he made early on about risk, there is an amazing thing about risk, and humans are really bad at understanding risk. And you can see that because we will take a bet on, say, WeWorks, and think that we can put billions of dollars into something that essentially is a real estate company and pretend it's a technology company and lose it all and then go do it again. But we will then spend enormous amounts of time worrying whether our investment in a natural climate solution or green gray infrastructure, something like that, will prove out. So we tend to give, all due respect to the people who made a lot of money in Silicon Valley and other places, we tend to give a lot of freedom to folks who are making money on taking bets on things that, you know, most people can't actually explain why they are making money. But we tend to then hold, you know, things that we do in terms of innovation in the global south, or innovation in climate change or natural climate solutions at a bar, at a much, much higher bar. And I think we have to figure out a better way to talk about the reasons why innovation and de-risking, you know, investing in natural climate solutions and other technological solutions in the global south is ultimately going to be so beneficial.
And the only thing I would add, because I so appreciate everything that's been said, Craig mentioned it quickly, but that we don't talk enough about the business model innovation, that I do believe that there will be technologies that the United States will benefit from that have been developed in the developing world. What we see is extraordinary business models that are primarily focused on distributed models, which are incredibly important in these times of growing fragility, given the increasing vicissitudes of weather and climate. And you certainly see that in off-grid. Number two, there's a whole story to be told about solving our biggest problems in ways that build not just jobs, but careers. And if you look at Kawisafi, which is the energy fund supported by GCF, it's been up and running for 4 years and has brought 120 million people electricity, but it's also created thousands of jobs, 30% of which are held by women. When you meet the young people that are in these jobs, they see that they're part of solving their nation's biggest problems. And so there's a real move to their own empowerment. And I think this is also a story that we need to bring to the US that can learn from the rest of the world. And Dante, we also are in coffee. And in both coffee and chocolate, we're seeing some of the most innovative models that insist on starting with making the farmers whole, paying a living wage, and then building through the supply chain to find a customer base that's willing to participate. And so it's this storytelling that I think GCF and all of us can also do, that is part of shifting, making the culture shift that Yannick talked about right up front.
Thank you all for those perspectives, particularly for the emphasis on coffee, farming, and agriculture, because that actually takes care of an audience question that we had received. Before we go to the next topic, I would like to invite Yannick to intervene in case he has any thoughts or reflections on what we've been hearing here over the course of the last hour.
Many thanks, Carlos. With your permission, I will maybe intervene at the end, because there are 5 points that have resonated very strongly with me during this conversation. And I've already been given 5-6 minutes at the beginning, so I would like to give a chance to our panelists to speak before I take a few additional minutes toward the end.
Thank you. We'll continue then. And we have a topic that we'd like to invite Dante, Craig, and Jacqueline to discuss, which is the innovative blended finance solutions that many of you are familiar with. These are solutions that are designed to accelerate to a clean, healthy, and resilient economy. These are also solutions that highlight GCF's de-risking approach and the role of equity in this model. Please have at it. We can start with Dante.
Thank you very much. Yeah, indeed. I think, look, in financing all these new resilient infrastructure requires a lot of capital. And capital markets, I got to tell you, are actually not strange to the climate dilemma. And the role of the Green Climate Fund, and that's why I mentioned at the beginning, it's not, I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm not appreciative of the funds of the Green Climate Fund. I'm more appreciative of having the brand name of the Green Climate Fund being a partner to the infrastructure we finance through CAVE. So sometimes blending resources from donor countries, from institutions friendly to the green climate cause, requires some credibility, because sometimes in the name of good environmental practices, you might finance whatever. So having the Green Climate Fund as a partner is like a seal of approval that the world has reviewed through a very independent panel what constitutes a legitimate cause, a legitimate project that will improve the lives of people. So in the case of CAVE, we do blend resources to fund different projects. So and let me get back to my example of the electrical train in Costa Rica. Why I think it's so important to have the Green Climate Fund as a partner. Because there's a public part, there's a private part. So in the public part, we are actually getting a lot of support from the Green Climate Fund. And then once we have all the secure financing from the public side, we will go to the private sector to get $1.5 billion projects, financing for that project. So the credibility seal of the Green Climate Fund is essential. And it doesn't have to be the whole 100% of the project financing. I mean, if it were, fantastic, but I know, I mean, the world has many priorities, and I'm sure Yannick is just scratching his head, how do I actually allocate this fund? So I don't want everything, I want some of it only, to allow our projects to become credible to the international investors and allow countries like Costa Rica to fulfill their policies of decarbonization. Thank you, Carlos.
Craig.
Well, we've talked a lot about risk and the challenge, and we've talked about how, in part because of that perception of risk, nowhere near what is needed is flowing to the developing world, where really all so much of the action needs to be in emerging markets. And the Green Climate Fund does play a critical risk. Let me maybe briefly describe for everyone blended finance as it relates to some of what we're doing with the Green Climate Fund. Essentially, blended finance uses both concessional capital or risk-taking capital to facilitate new capital coming in from folks who might otherwise not put it in. So we've launched with Yannick and his team something called the Subnational Climate Fund, a global subnational climate fund. There's been a lot written. Actually, Yannick wrote a paper on this together with a colleague I'm involved with in 2009, I think, about how the action needed to be at the grassroots level. More than 65% of what was needed in fighting climate change would be in smaller scale, mid-sized projects from mayors, governors, provincial leaders, and that area has largely been ignored. So providing in our situation, as an example, the Green Climate Fund has committed $150 million as junior capital, which takes first loss, actually takes lower returns, to attract capital to take the risk that Sanjay said people somehow don't seem to be willing to take. And it's in these smaller scale projects, many of which will be in LDCs, many of which will be in SIDS, but where so much is needed, I view them as great economic opportunities. Without the Green Climate Fund taking this, using this model of blended finance and basically limiting risk, there is, I think it'd be much harder to raise capital. And the goal obviously is to prove to people that we don't need as much blended finance going forward. But with all that we need today and to attract capital to flow into these areas, blended finance is absolutely critical.
And Jacqueline.
I completely agree with everything Craig said, and I appreciated his articulation of what blended capital is. For market purists, there's sometimes a pushback on blended capital because it's seen as distorting markets. And my response after having done this now for 20 years is that when you're working in places where markets don't really exist, there's not much to distort. And that what we actually need is a first mover who is willing to take the risk and to de-risk so that others will come in. And it's been an incredible role for Green Climate Fund as a first mover, as a first loss provider to attract other institutions into areas which they haven't been in. So again, we focus on poverty, and if you want to talk poverty, you have to talk agriculture and smallholder farmers. 2.4 billion farmers, smallholder farmers in the world represent 50% of people living in poverty. As I said before, they are the hardest hit by climate. And in this past year alone, we've seen locusts, droughts, floods, cyclones, sometimes in the same season. And so how do you build viable companies that enable poor farmers to stay on the farm, to adapt to the realities in ways, again, that mitigate for the future? And so an example is the Acumen Resilient Agriculture Fund, which started with first loss capital from GCF, without which, as I said, we would never have been able to raise the rest of the fund, which is about the facility, which is about a $60 million facility to invest in different nations in Africa. That's not the only blend, but we saw that once that was in place, that first loss, we were much more able to crowd in private finance. Side by side then is the recognition that you also have to build local capability, talent, and have the capacity to actually measure the social and environmental impact to show the seriousness of what we're actually doing. And there's a component to ensure that gender is fully integrated into this work. That's the kind of blend that is absolutely needed so that we can create companies and therefore stories of possibility. To Craig's point, that these become viable, like a company called Ethio Chicken, which is a recent investment from Arif, although much of this work was done pre-Arif with my organization. But started by 2 Americans 8 years ago in Ethiopia, where the chicken industry had mostly been run by government, and the average Ethiopian ate about a half a kilo of chicken a year. Chickens is an important way to adapt to climate, because in a case of a drought, you can sell your goat, you buy chickens will eat anything, and it's a source of protein and income when selling eggs. Long story for investment readiness by Arif, and it's now served 20 million smallholder farmers that have seen their incomes increase. And at the center, a new business model, are thousands of agents, some of whom have gone from making a couple $100 a year to more than $10,000 a year. It's been a success within the nation, so much so that government has credited this company and themselves, because they work in partnership, with reducing childhood malnutrition by 11%. We need more examples like this. And these examples don't happen without the kind of creative catalytic capital that can allow entrepreneurs the time it takes to build viable business models so that poor people can make their own decisions and have the dignity of being part of the world that we're in right now, which is a very volatile and fragile world.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Sanjay, and let's talk nature-based solutions. Forests, mangroves are discussed widely here in the southern tip of Florida. The United States Congress seems to be rallying some bipartisan support for the Trillion Trees initiative. How important are these solutions? There are concerns with regards to greenwashing, that sometimes these solutions are insufficient and that they're used politically by certain actors. Can you discuss nature-based solutions in the context of our conversation here today?
Sure, Carlos, and you're completely right. So nature-based solutions falls into 2 broad categories. One is obviously the ability for nature to absorb and store carbon, often for very long periods of time. I mean, it's quite literally taken hundreds of millions of years of evolution for photosynthesis to be the #1 technology on the planet that can do it cheaper and at larger scales than anything we have commercially available today, or anything, frankly, we'll have commercially available in the next, decade or 2 decades or so, in terms of being able to capture carbon and hold it. And of course, also nature-based solutions in terms of mitigation. The mangroves that you talk about in Florida absolutely do prevent storm surges, do keep coastal erosion in check, green gray infrastructure. When you combine hardened engineering structures with nature to provide buffers against storms, et cetera. tend to get better with time rather than worse with time, because nature grows stronger with time. The thing to remember about sort of nature-based solutions is, first and foremost, you cannot get to the Paris climate target, or frankly, any other realistic target, without including nature-based solutions. Just impossible to do that. If the Amazon continues to deforest at the rate it's going right now, you just won't be able to make the math work, no matter what you do elsewhere. So you absolutely have to invest in it. Very little of the funding available today is crowding into this space. Most of it is going into technological innovations, which is a great thing. But if you want an ROI, honestly, for example, if people on this call want to actually turn the dial, turn the thermostat of the planet in their lifetime, all we need to do, or not all we do, one of the best things we can do is just protect mangroves. Tiny sliver of an ecosystem, unbelievably hardworking, 6 times more carbon dense than almost any other ecosystem on the planet. Just that tiny sliver of habitat will actually change the thermostat on the planet in our lifetimes, hopefully. So the ROI is very, very big in terms of investing. Very little money is going into it. So when you invest in it, you actually get a pretty big return. On the greenwashing side, I hear this a lot. And honestly, I'm a huge skeptic. Believe me, I'm a cynical guy. I don't really see that much. I think social media, young people are way too smart to buy, greenwashing anymore. I think people are being held accountable. Most of the times, the commitments that companies are making today are coming from the CEOs or from the board. It's not from their sustainability officers anymore. It's the CEOs. And they talk about it, Doug McMillan or, Alan Jope or, David Taylor, they talk about it in deeply, deeply personal terms. So I actually think it's quite real. Now, in terms of companies being allowed to go and get offsets by protecting nature, obviously protecting nature and doing reforestation and better managing forest ecosystems in particular is a good thing. But companies should not be allowed to do that as their main way of bringing down their carbon emissions. I think it is really important that we tell companies, you got to do everything you can right now to, transition, your methods to get better at how you use your resources. You have to actually drop emissions and then use nature-based solutions for that delta, for that little piece of the wedge that you cannot fit in really any other way with any reasonable time. And that's where time is important, because if a company makes a 2050 pledge, that's great. I'm not really interested in a 2050 pledge. I'm interested in the roadmap that gets us there. I want to know what they're going to do in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. That's where the green climate, that's where nature-based solutions really comes into play, because it helps us meet those intermediate steps to get to where we need to go.
I think that was very helpful. Thank you, Sanjay. And I know especially people in parts of the world like mine really appreciate your comments. I want to ask all of you now to address the paradox at the heart of climate science. On the one hand, there's about $14 trillion of investments earning negative interest rates. That's nearly a quarter of all investment grade debt. On the other hand, we have $23 trillion in attractive opportunities for climate smart investments in emerging markets between now and 2030. What will it take to move a significant amount of this capital into climate investments in developing countries? Anyone can take that first.
Can I start?
Please.
Thank you, Carlos. I took over Cave in 2018, and I found something that was very remarkable, and it's a preparation fund. Basically, what you have said, this paradox is insensitive. I don't know why people do not see it as clearly. Sometimes the challenges, but you have to actually make the project, basically write something. I mean, the storyline, the numbers, does it make sense? Does it make the consultations? So you have to carry out certain amount of work to determine whether your idea makes sense or not. I mean, we all know it. Bankers do that as a day-to-day business. Yet, when you want to invest, when you are a government and you want to prepare a project, you want to prepare a safe project, a project that will actually, you are sure is feasible, so you will carry it out anyway. But when you actually want to prepare a project that is risky, is innovative, you usually do not have the funds to prepare that type of project. So we at CAVE, actually, we do have a preparation fund called Contingency Fund. So basically what we do is that we finance, a community comes to us and says, well, you know, I want to restore my forest around my community and do sustainable forestry. So we do go ahead and finance the project and finance the preparation of the project with this contingency fund. If the project makes sense and there's a loan eventually, we actually charge the loan with the proceeds of the preparation of the project. If the project is a no-go, we actually take that as a loss. And what we have discovered is that there's a lot of trial and error, and communities are afraid of using their own funding to prepare projects. So we are actually in the midst of having the Green Climate Fund as a partner to this. The EU already is a partner to this project preparation fund at CAVE. In my earlier life at the World Bank, and we did have a project preparation fund, but with so many rules that it was almost impossible to access it. So it's no wonder what you cite, that there's a lot of funds sitting idly, earning negative returns, while there are good projects, but there are no good sources of financing to prepare these projects to show investors this makes sense, to show the story. I mean, I like what Jacqueline mentioned. These storylines do not happen automatically. You have to actually bet a bit, pilot those ideas, make mistakes. I always say, look, it's okay to make mistakes. You can get it wrong the first time, the second time, the third time will be fantastic, I'm pretty sure. But you don't do this with borrowed money. You do this with innovation funds that, you might lose the money in trying to find out the perfect solution. So, so I think this paradox you mentioned is the lack of readily available project preparation funds. And I'm so happy with Yannick, we are actually partnering in beefing up our project preparation fund at CAVE and do air dams to help communities to get water during the summer and to actually hold the rivers when it rains too much. So we are doing that in smaller scale, in larger scale, and we are trying these models. And there's no way you can do that with regular commercial money. So I think the paradox is centers around the lack of good money that is not afraid of losing some when trying out these new innovative ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dante. Anyone else want to add to that?
Well, I just can't help myself. I so appreciated what Dante said. And when I'm hearing Dante, it's also, we need the right kind of capital. We so often talk about capital as if it's a bludgeon, and there's one market rate, period. And what we've been all talking about throughout this panel is the need for the right capital along the spectrum, both of organizational development and economic development, taking into consideration different populations and different geographies. And so it's a plea for nuance, number one. And number two, overriding, we have had a conversation about the technicalities that are needed: concessionary debt, first loss capital, blended instruments, etc. But what I think you hear, the emotion in everyone's voice is really what's required is our moral imagination. That we don't need more technical shifts, we need a mind shift. And I think that comes from the kinds of business models we develop, the role models that are out there, and the stories we tell. And I don't think you would find many panels that would be this passionate about a big development finance institution, quite frankly. But the kind of leadership that Yannick and GCF has provided is allowing oxygen for these kinds of models and these kinds of partnerships, and we need more of them. And so I think at the end of the day, we need to all be part of building a coalition that starts to demand that we move away from business as usual. And Sanjay talks about some real hope. I'm with him. Let's build on the ones that are moving, and hold people accountable.
Jacqueline, thank you for both of those comments. My mother used to always say, there's no time like the present. And wow, is there no time like the present? You hear about this paradox. We don't have time. We need to act. And that can be obviously government leadership, the US engaging, but under Yannick's leadership, the Green Climate Fund's taking risks. And I think we do have to tell the stories. We need to be bold. And I think it's a time, if I just think about what we're doing with some of the things, the Green Climate Fund, getting people who might not work together to work together as part of that bold thinking. We have Green Climate Fund as our risk capital, our anchor investor. We have BNP Paribas as a member of our consortium. We have IUCN. I mean, it's weird we'd be teaming up with them, but we're looking forward to that. Sanjay, team up with you at some point. We have Gold Standard as a certifying, and this is a very important area Jacqueline touched on, proving what we're doing, measuring to make sure, using MRV standardization to validate and report and measure that we're doing what we're saying, engaging corporations. And then our other partner with what we're doing is an organization called the R20, which is focused on regional subnational governments, engaging them in capacity building. I think these sorts of partnerships and then building the stories upon them, success upon success, is what it's going to take to start getting capital flowing and mission-driven capital where we can prove success.
Carlos, if I could just add one thing, last week we launched in partnership with Apple and Goldman Sachs a fund called the Restore Fund, and it's a roughly $200 million fund to do particularly forestry projects with obviously a inflation plus something return for investors, but a carbon return as well. And CI is a co-partner in this, and also we help guarantee that the projects we take on are of the highest sort of social and environmental standards. The reason I thought this fund was so unique and interesting was because it was making use of Apple's not philanthropic funding or really even direct carbon funding, but its strong balance sheets. So you got to imagine, companies are running out of things right now, particularly right now with the way the stock market is, they're running out of things to invest in. And the notion that there's trillions of dollars, I mean, that's an unbelievable number, sitting around essentially, doing nothing except keeping someone feeling safe, is an astonishing thing. I mean, it's the same reason we all went and, hoarded toilet paper at the beginning of the COVID crisis. Remember that? And it's the same reason why, environmental organizations still build very large endowments. I mean, it's insane to think that conservation will be cheaper tomorrow than it is today. I mean, why would you build an endowment of any size, right? But it's that mental block that we have about safety. And I think this is where the Green Climate Fund can send that signal. What Dante says about, project preparation funding, but also, opening the door for corporations to get involved, to use that balance sheet to do good. And I think we have to press governments to send a signal as well, because governments can send that signal about certainty that ultimately can help drive the market.
Thank you, Sanjay. Mr. Executive Director, although you didn't want to speak until the end, someone in our audience is insisting otherwise. They want to hear from you for those in developing countries working on the front lines of climate change, whether they be organizations, small businesses. What can they do to get access to the Green Climate Fund? How can they get in touch?
Thanks a lot, Carlos. I didn't want to take the floor before the end because actually this discussion is too rich, and I was afraid that I would end up intervening every second of the discussion. Now, regarding this question, indeed, maybe that's best to be addressed to me. The Green Climate Fund is a partnership organization. We do not originate, develop, and implement our projects. We basically co-finance and de-risk the projects of our partners, such as KB, such as Pegasus, such as Acumen, such as Conservation International, to enable them to raise and realize their climate ambition. And right now we work with more than 200 partners. And so this includes national and international bank, national and international development bank, national and international commercial banks, equity investment fund, national, international civil society organization, United Nations organizations. And the about 60% of our partners are actually direct access organization. For us, it's certainly one of our key comparative advantages. If Dante, I hope you won't mind that I take the example of the public development banks, the national and regional development banks. They account for 10% of total investment worldwide, $2 trillion a year. And right now, most of them do not have a climate mandate. Most of them do not have an in-house expertise to be able to assess the risk of a climate investment and structure it to de-risk it. And most of them do not have access to capital markets. I think only 68 of the 250 national and regional development banks have access to international capital markets. And let's imagine what could be the result if we could double the number of national and regional development banks that will have access to capital markets. And if we could basically empower these partners to be able to come up with a mandate, such as, for example, 20–25% of my resources in climate change. Certainly, a lot of what we have been discussing would have been resolved, because here you are not speaking in billions, we are speaking in trillions. And so for us, one of our key priorities is to work with direct access entity. That means institutions from developing countries to basically enable them to access market, enable them to develop a pipeline of climate investment opportunities, and to de-risk the first generation of their projects. So exactly what Dante was speaking about. Now, it's what do we provide? We do provide a seal of guarantee. It's very difficult to be accredited to the Green Climate Fund. Let's be very clear, because you have to demonstrate that you have the project management capacity, the fiduciary management capacity, but also the environmental and social safeguard capacity. But it's a seal of approval. Once you have been accredited, this dramatically basically increase your standing, including for accessing capital markets. So for an agency that is not yet an accredited partner of the Green Climate Fund, the first step is to go for an accreditation. It takes time. So in parallel to that, my recommendation would be work with one of our existing accredited entity. Any of the accredited entity present here tonight can work with any other entity as what we call in our jargon an executing entity, another partner. So if you want to work with the Green Climate Fund, first port of call, work with one of the 200 delivery partners that we have. And listening to some of these partners, I'm sure that a number of you can have an idea about with whom you could work. And in parallel to that, you can perfectly develop your accreditation request. And we hope that soon our board will also develop a new mechanism that is called project-specific accreditation agreement that enable us to accredit one entity only for one project, so we can go far faster. And this would be particularly important, for example, for technologies. We have discussed about the need to foster technologies in developing countries. Often you are speaking about one company with one technology. Here we are speaking about one project, and you don't want them to go through a full accreditation process. And therefore we hope to have soon this mechanism to be able to help one company with one technology to move to scale.
Thank you, Yannick, for that explanation. I understand we now have a question from the floor. Mr. Jim McDermott, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much, Carlos and the rest of the team. I really appreciate the time today, so I'll try to be brief. My question is really listening to the panel talk about this movement of technology from developed countries into the emerging markets and sort of how that plays out. One of the things that I've been a private equity investor for the better part of 25 years, and I'm on a board of direct air capture companies and companies that are sort of creating value-added products from waste streams and things like that. And one of the things that I've seen over and over again as we've tried to transfer technologies out of the United States into emerging markets is the difficulty that often ensues in that process. And I'm just very curious how Craig and Jacqueline and Sanjay and others see this process of as we move, traditionally projects have been very asset-based. As we're moving more intellectual property and services and things of that nature out of the United States or out of the developed OECD countries and into the emerging and growth-oriented countries, how they see the Green Climate Fund playing a role, and how that, and frankly, would be really helpful is any specific examples that you can give to the group of sort of how that process has worked and how the concessionary capital has worked, because I think I would just love to hear your views on how the actual practical implications work out. I don't know, Craig or Yannick, maybe you take a cut at that.
Well, I could. Yannick, you want to take it first, Yannick, then I'll respond after.
I've been listening to all of you in Elm because you are all of you much more articulate than me. So I would prefer to let you have a first go, Greg.
Well, I think the Green Climate Fund can play a number of roles, and I'll talk again maybe a little bit about what we're doing and we're launching. First, to be able to deploy Green Climate Fund capital, you need approval from the particular emerging market countries. So you start with something where they've said they want investment from either a project level or a fund like ours with a subnational climate fund. And we've been very careful to work and stay in touch with the countries and the authorities and then build a base on the ground. So automatically we're coming both with the Green Climate Fund seal of approval, that intangible, but also relationships with at a country level, and then we're in particular working again at the subnational level with cities, regions to get them involved. Then there's a network which also comes with that of local partners, which are really crucial. So which again we're developing. One of the I think huge opportunities here, Jim, is to effectively act as an emerging market co-development partner to help bring these technologies in. I mean, that's partly what we're set up to do. And I think Jacqueline can do the same with what she's doing. We can really help make it much easier for companies like yours to penetrate. Again, part of it's the Green Climate Fund validation. There are other financing mechanisms, and there's really this catalytic capital where for every dollar the Green Climate Fund puts in to us, which we can put into a project, we'll get project finance from local or other or DFI lenders on top of it. So I think we can dramatically accelerate deployment of capital like yours.
To build on your point, Greg, I think basically it depends very much on the size of your investment and the type of technology. If we're speaking about investment of, I would say, between 20 to 30 to $50 million, even smaller, there we finance a number of private equity funds that invest in technology development. And with Greg and Jacqueline, you have two of our key partners. Now, if we're speaking about a much larger infrastructure project, there we have a dedicated project only for that one. I will take, for example, the example of Espero de Tarapaca, which is a solar seawater project in Chile. It's a project of over $1 billion. And this project, the technology is to basically use solar energy to pump seawater to a high point in the Tarapacá Desert. And at night, you generate hydroelectricity. So basically, you convert solar into what we call a base load energy. You can use it 24 hours a day. And the potential is gigantic. The duplication potential is estimated at over 300 gigawatts, the equivalent of more than 300 nuclear plants, if you prefer. And so this project, this technology has an immense potential, but will never have been financed on its own because of the technology risk, because it's a first of its kind, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we ended up doing was to provide, if my memory is correct, $150 million of anchor investment. We were the first to put our money on the table. And this money was used by our partners, Wildlife Fund and Mitsubishi Bank, to basically mobilize senior equity investors and after use this equity to mobilize commercial debts from Mitsubishi Bank. And so there, it's a major technology, a gigantic piece of infrastructure, over $1 billion, but with a gigantic potential. And we provided a first loss equity investment in order to reassure other investors. So the short response to your question is that it depends on the technology. It depends on the size of the investment, and we can move from a growth fund to a larger equity fund to a dedicated infrastructure investment project.
And the only thing I would add to Yannick and Craig, Jim, is, and probably the reason you got a big hesitation when you first asked the question, is that it's as much about the private equity player and where you see your own appetite for risk, time, and the kinds of technologies you're interested in. So Craig would be looking at, as he said, slightly larger investments and more infrastructure than Acumen, which is really looking at business models that work with very low-income people. And yet, because of this layered capital that GCF brings in, when you look at leverage, we might get 3x leverage in terms of direct investment into the fund. But then once you are part of leading a round, that company might bring in 35x the kind of leverage from the beginning of GCF. But the co-investors into the kinds of companies that we're a part of are very interested in business models and more distributed types of technologies rather than the kind that Yannick just described. So I think it is back to that nuance and that it depends as the answer.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And we are approaching the end of our time together. So what I'd like to do is to invite our four panelists to just give us some closing thoughts here as we approach the top of the 10 a.m. hour in the east of the United States. And we'll go in this order: Sanjay, Craig, Dante, and then Jacqueline. And before you start, Sanjay, and I just want to thank all of you for your time again. This has been a wonderful discussion, full of information, and hopefully it will inspire people to support important causes like the Green Climate Fund. Sanjay, and kick us off here with some closing thoughts.
Thank you, Carlos, and thank you, Yannick, and to all the panelists. It's rare to spend 2 hours and learn so much. I'm going to keep very brief because I honestly want to hear from the other panelists. I'm just learning so much today. You know, Yannick, I think what you and the Green Climate Fund needs to fully understand and embrace is that you are the #1 game in town when it comes to dealing with climate change in this sort of comprehensive manner that we are approaching it with for the global South. You know, the last best hope, I'm bringing up, Star Wars mythology here, but really quite literally, I'm so impressed with how far you've moved the organization in the last couple of years in your leadership, and also now the new opportunity available with some of the governments, particularly the United States, finally willing to really lean in and absolutely, meet their commitments and then exceed it as well. I think that we ought to continue to work hard on reducing the preparation times for projects, to being a little bit more as flexible as we can be, given the challenges and the rules that you operate under. And also to Dante's point about how we can access project preparation funding in a way, either through Green Climate Fund or through other mechanisms, in order to reduce that, the speed of action. And speed is critical here. You've got 10 years, we've already down by 2. So every year the clock is ticking if we're going to change the trajectory of the planet. I really want to make sure that we continue to invest in natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions for adaptation mitigation. I do believe it brings you great ROI, in addition to all the other things we've talked about. And I also think that we have to find, stronger mechanisms and just be willing to take the risk in terms of partnering with the corporate sector and to push sort of financial innovation when it comes to, driving that trillions of dollars that are sitting there essentially doing nothing except keeping someone safe and warm and really putting it to use to keep the entire planet safe and cool. So thank you so much to everyone. Really enjoyed it. And thank you, Carlos, for your wonderful moderation.
Thank you, Sanjay. And Craig?
Well, so much to say, but I will try to be brief too. And Carlos, thank you for your dedication to this issue and climate issues generally, as well as being such a wonderful moderator. And it really has been thrilling to be part of the panel. And I know we'll have lots of follow-up conversations afterwards. So just a couple of quick thoughts. One, I said no time like the present. The Global South is, I think, where the action is for the present, the future, and the Green Climate Fund is the leader. We have to make dramatic change. Again, Yannick and team are leading the way. Number two, adaptation is coming. The Green Climate Fund's dedicated to it. When we speak to people in islands, you can't speak about mitigation without adaptation. That's what everyone cares about. And I think the Green Climate Fund's continued focus on that is critical. And we're spending more and more time at Pegasus on that as well. Number three, I applaud the focus on nature-based solutions. So critical. We can learn so much. Well, and again, I see it in our human health investments. We can take more from nature, both planet, human health, and providing clean air, clean water, as well as dealing with the carbon crisis. So Sanjay, thank you for all your work, and together with a number of other folks leading in nature-based solutions. My last quick comment we touched on is technology, transfer, innovation. And I do think this will go two ways. I'm working with an amazing Indian waste company that we want to bring to the United States. But I think there is such an opportunity for technology and innovation to be brought, I'm speaking to some of my US friends and colleagues on this call, to the emerging markets. We'll learn, we'll create new business models, as Jacqueline said. So I really do think those of you on this call who've heard about this, it can be a wonderful opportunity for business development, learning, and creation of US jobs and continued evolution of US technology, as well as technology from everyone around the world.
Dante.
Carlos, thank you, and Yannick and everyone, thank you very much. This is much appreciated. Just two messages. I closing remarks from my side. As they say, there's no time like today. We are at CABE working very hard, very concerned about climate change. We had hurricanes every year. Last year, as I mentioned, we had two, separated by 2 weeks, and they caused $3 billion in damages in just 2 weeks' time. So investments in climate change are urgent, and we need to prepare now. And I do appreciate this type of forum in which we can actually convey the urgency of working now for tomorrow. But at the same time, we need to plan for the longer term, as Sanjay said, for sons and grandkids. And when I see room for improvement, I mean, Central America, just to give you an example, transport is relatively easy to change since we are net importers of trucks, buses, but where are they? We want electric transportation to be friendlier with the environment. and yet it's very hard for us to find manufacturers of these technologies. So we need more from our partners in developed countries to get markets closer to us, not only financial markets, but actually asset markets, to be more open and don't be afraid of coming to Central America. We are, we do have open arms and we pay back our commitment. So, and there's CABE behind it. So my closing remark is thank you for the opportunity. We need to, I'm deeply concerned about today, but also I'm deeply concerned about the planning for the future. I mean, we cannot forget that we need to plan ahead. These transitions take time, and we better start today than tomorrow. Thank you very much to everyone. I learned a lot today as well.
We all did. Thank you, Dante. And Jacqueline, please help us wrap up this panel.
Thanks so much. Carlos, your moderation has been wonderful. And I do think it's rare, as Sanjay said, 2 hours spent with this extraordinary group. And I feel a real sense of having learned a great deal and also very hopeful for the world. Yannick and Babita, just a privilege to be part of this and to be partnering. So thank you. Really moved as well by all three comments that preceded me. Dante talking about thinking of the future and this two-way transfer of technology and the willingness of people to pay if we only can have access to these opportunities. And that is this moment. And then when I straddle Sajay and Craig, what strikes me is in some ways we really are living at this moment of great peril, extraordinary peril, and also possibility. Craig reminds me that everyone in this group is seekers. None of us think we have the answers, but we're all willing to take bets on entrepreneurs that are trying to accompany them, to build the solutions, and when we see them, to take them to scale. And that's got to be what we do with greater and greater urgency. And then as Sanjay, when you were talking about the trillions of dollars that stay in accounts to keep people safe, how do we juxtapose that with a story that is not about fear mongering, but that is really about possibility? Because if you look at Africa, just as a single story, we're talking about 1.2 billion people. The population is, we know, best case scenario will double by 2050 and has a possibility of quadrupling by 2050. Today, going back to this urgency versus the future, 60% or 720 million of the 1.2 billion Africans are under the age of 25. Just wrap your heads around that in the context of this conversation, that either we get very creative about the investing that we are doing so that people can solve their own problems and contributing to their nations, or we will create stability, not instability, or we will enable instability, not only there, but everywhere. And I think that that is a story that has to, as we move, we see so much nationalism that has to bind us as a world. And that is where Yannick and GCF's leadership is most important, because climate is a global issue. There are very local solutions that must be attempted and built, but then we have to share them across the world. And that's the opportunity that we have. So one of the words I leave is safe, and the false conceit of that word, and that the real safety we get as a world is when we have dignity, every one of us. And that is ultimately what we're talking about. That is the work of GCF, and that is the work of the partners. And that's why I'm so excited to be part of this, and just wish Yannick, Babita, everyone at GCF, the best of luck, that you've got real partners that want to be your foot soldiers.
Thank you, Jacqueline. What a wonderful way to close out this panel. And with that, I want to turn it over to Yannick for his closing thoughts and reflections, and to thank him and the entire team at GCF, Babita, and everyone else for making this possible and for convening all of us today.
Many thanks, Carlos. Many thanks to all the participants in this event. I was planning to bounce back on the number of ideas, but I'm afraid we have run out of time. So I will limit my remarks to just echo a few points on the blended finance and on innovation and environmental and social safeguards. We have been discussing about this paradox at the heart of climate finance, the fact that money does not flow from negative yield debt to potentially very high return opportunities in developing countries. And this is basically the climate finance manifestation of the famous Lucas paradox. We know that blended finance is one of the most powerful tools that we have to de-risk frontier investment, pioneer investment, and establish a track record for the financiers to be able to better assess the actual risk of investment. And be able to go to Sidente and say, okay, no, we are in. Jacqueline, you addressed something critical with blended finance, the fact that it's often criticized for distorting market. And your answer was beautiful. How can you distort a market that does not exist when you are actually using blended finance to create a market? But this said, there are problems with blended finance. And one of the worst problems for me is that blended finance, by and large, only work for mature technologies in mature economies. It does not work for early stage technologies in early stage economies. And what makes you guys as an unbelievable group is that all of you are basically experimenting to make blended finance works for the most vulnerable. And I come back to some of the points you made, Jacqueline, and what Acumen is doing, to make blended finance work for adaptation and works for nature-based solution. And I come back to some of the points you made, Greg and Sanjayan. Sanjayan, when you spoke about irrecoverable carbon, I hope you were not only mentioning terrestrial carbon, but also coastal and marine ecosystem carbon. And we know that that's some of the most difficult and important irrecoverable carbon to protect: mangrove, seagrass, forest, kelp, plankton. And one of the things that for me is extremely exciting today, I got a copy of a concept note for a private equity fund for coral reef management. And I'm not to go further detail because it's not at this stage. It's involved somebody in this group. And but can you imagine how much we will have pushed blended finance if we can make it if we can leverage it for protecting coral reef and the livelihood of 500 million people who depend on coral reef? I would like to move to innovation. Right now we are not on track to achieve the Paris Agreement's goal. We are nowhere where we should be. This said, we have plenty of examples in histories of innovations that have basically broken development trend and made the impossible possible. For example, the Industrial Revolution was ushered by one institutional innovation, the limited company, that pooled the risk and the investment of plenty of investors to finance the first, second, and third industrial revolution. And so we know that innovation is extremely important. But we know also that innovation can create new unforeseen problems and does not benefit everybody equally, does not benefit women as well as it benefits men, does not benefit the poor as well as it benefits the rich. And for example, for the 1 billion people who do not have access to electricity, the first and the second and the third revolution could have as well never happened. And so environmental and social safeguard, it's not only about not doing harm, it's also about doing good. And it's extraordinarily important to ensure that innovation is not only transformative, but also responsible and inclusive, and benefit women as much as men, benefit the poor as much as the rich. And I would like to strongly echo the words of Erica. One of the dimensions I'm the most proud about with the Green Climate Fund has been the work done to put in place extremely robust environmental and social safeguards, an IP policy, a gender policy. A lot of work remains to be done, but if we can push the frontiers of blended finance to foster innovation, but in innovation that is not only transformative, but also inclusive and responsible, we will be able to come up with a fantastic message of hope. Today in climate, the problem are not so much people who are not engaged or climate deniers, it's climate fatalists, those who believe that we have lost the battle. And I really believe that if we bring all the talents, all the ideas that have been discussed today, we can have a very strong message of hope to basically re-engage climate fatalists. So for all of that, I would like to deeply thank you. And I think I will send an official request to the US State Department to see if we could use one of the sentences of Secretary Kerry as one of our motto, which is putting new ideas to work and scaling up existing ideas, because that's the most beautiful way, the most elegant way to capture what we are about that I've ever heard. Thanks a lot to all of you. And Carlos, you were a magnificent moderator.
Thank you, Yannick. Well, I am just grateful for the privilege of moderating this wonderful discussion. It is my hope that this discussion and others like it will inspire the Congress of my country, the United States, to work together on a bipartisan basis for meaningful climate action, of course, here domestically, but equally as important throughout the globe, especially in those countries and communities that are in greatest need. We're a little over time, but I'm not allowed to dismiss you. For that, we will turn to Babita with my gratitude once again.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We had more than 470 participants at one point from all over the world. We look forward to continuing this dialogue on climate finance and climate action. We're also pleased to let you know that Yannick will be participating at the climate financing session of the Leaders Summit on the 22nd of April. Thank you to all who have worked so hard and in such a short span of time, to Carlos, our excellent moderator, our speakers, including our interpreters, and also other friends like Alex Flint and Terry Tamminen. And a big shout out to our amazing team too. We look forward to engaging with all of you as we continue to tell the story of working together for transformative climate action, for people, for planet, and for prosperity. Thank you so much once again, and goodbye.
Thank you very much, everybody. Have a
Bye,
great
everyone.
day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Babita. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.